So I was thinking about some of the things that I said about consequentialisms and how more sophisticated consequentialisms seem to work better than simplistic consequentialisms like utilitarianism. So what I mean by a sophisticated consequentialism is a view, a moral view, where you take a much more sophisticated, or how can I put it, pluralistic view of what contributes to human well-being. So it's interesting. There are some implications of this, of my view. I actually do hold a very sophisticated consequentialist type of view. But there are some interesting consequences of this. And the first one, interesting consequences, I mean implications. So the first one is that it is not really possible for individuals to be moral experts. So when you think about any sort of consequentialist view, you're going to have some understanding of what brings about pleasure for most people, or even specific individuals you might be working with, say like your loved ones. You might have more in-depth knowledge about them personally, so you can benefit them in ways that other people can't, right? So, but it requires a certain amount of knowledge. But knowledge is not an individual phenomenon, it's a social phenomenon. So you have to kind of rely on even science to tell us what human well-being consists in, right? So there are some things that are better for us than other things. And I think one reason why people don't like the more sophisticated sort of consequentialist views is because that moves moral expertise out of the personal domain and into the social domain. So what I mean by that is that it's not the case that these more complicated consequentialist theories sort of entail. It's not the case that an individual can ever be fully morally competent. They can never necessarily be considered a moral expert. And people don't like that. They don't like to think that they're not the moral expert, right? Expertise is really hard to acquire. It's hard to attain in any area, in any domain. To become an expert in that domain, you really have to work hard. You have to know a lot. You have to put a lot of time and energy into that. But that's something that a lot of people don't want to think is the case with morality. They want to think it's a lot simpler than it actually is. And I think that this is largely sort of a throwover. I like to call these medieval hangovers. It is a hangover from the very simplistic kind of religious practice that people have engaged in over the years, right? So if you just tell people, look, here's God and here's the devil and there's this battle, and God is good and the devil is bad, and we promote the things of God and we don't promote the things of the devil, right? That's sort of like a very simplistic type of consequentialism, although I have views about what moral theories religions actually promote, and they're kind of different than what people think they are. But in any case, those sort of the view that if you just rely on God, right? And so this is actually a feature of some Buddhisms as well, right? So this isn't just Christianity. This isn't just Western religion. There are all kinds of religious practices where you rely on God, right? So you don't know. You're in a limited epistemic position. You don't know what the right thing to do is. The simple answer is to rely on God and just let God guide you. And there are Buddhisms. There are various kinds of Buddhisms, and there are Buddhisms that have a similar kind of view, where there are these people have been elevated. Right? So people who have lived a proper kind of life, they have ceased to exist on this plane, but they have been elevated. I think the term is a bodhisattva. Anyway, they've been elevated to a certain position where they have influence over human affairs, and if you just worship or submit yourself to that individual, then things will go well for you. So I actually taught some of this stuff when I taught Asian philosophy. It was years ago. It was like 7 years ago. I taught this particular version of Asian philosophy, and one of the philosophies that Asian philosophies that we covered in the class. And I remember thinking that it is very similar to a type of Christianity. And the person, and honestly, it's been so long since I've looked at this, I can't remember the names of the philosophers, but the philosopher who was responsible for sort of promoting this sort of idea, or the group of philosophers, their idea was this, that morality is actually quite difficult. Doing life is quite difficult. The best that people can do is to rely on some figurehead who can do it for them. And I think that there is actually some truth in that. The problem is when we pick the wrong one. So I think that we like to think that there's just a simple answer, that there's one individual, or there's one church, or there's one idea that we can rely on to make us moral beings. And that's just, I think, oversimplified. But I do think that the sort of individual guide is a really powerful idea. But I think that that can be used in a way that is more likely to produce positive results. So, if you start with the idea that communities, and not just any community, but particular kind of communities, are the source of moral expertise, that no individual in that community is the moral expert, but that communities themselves have the property of having moral expertise, then you've got to look at what kind of community is going to bring this sort of state of affairs about. And I'm not saying that answering any of these questions is easy. These are difficult problems, right, that philosophers sort of wrestle with. I don't know anybody who has this particular view. It's probably out there somewhere, but I haven't encountered my particular view in the literature. So I think there are probably pieces of it out there, but I don't know anybody who promotes this particular view. So this is my view. There may be other philosophers who actually have written work on this particular subject. I've read a lot of work on moral expertise, but that's still locating moral expertise at an individual level rather than a communal level. So if you look at the kind of a community that you need in order to have moral expertise, you're going to want to have a community that's really sort of representative, in as many ways as possible, representative of humanity in general, right? So you're going to end up with a very diverse community. And what's difficult about engaging in a very diverse community is that it takes a lot of work to actually get along, right? But it's doable. And I think that there's a moral imperative to do that, because I think that there's no way to really achieve moral expertise without that sort of arrangement. What this means is that you've got to have a really properly functioning community. And that's not easy, right? So this is a challenge. This is always going to be a challenge. Every society has had this challenge. And they've all had different answers about how to organize society in a way to be the most effective or whatever. But unfortunately, what's happening in the United States is we're not organizing our societies by what is the morally best thing to do, right? What's going to achieve a type of moral expertise that can solve some of our biggest social problems. What we're worried about is what is most efficient and most economical and what creates the most utility, right? And not necessarily for the greatest number of people, but for a sort of select group of people who are like this cream on the top. So that you can have different organizing principles for societies. And I have yet to encounter one. Where the organizing principle is this push for moral expertise. And part of the reason is because I think people have oversimplified morality, and they think that it's something that individuals can just achieve fairly quickly and easily. I think that people think they're just innate. There's just this innate sense of morality, which I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I think that there's a lot of socialization that goes into that. I'm a little bit Aristotelian in that sense. So, and the process of moral socialization is also another reason why we ought to think about creating societies where the organizing principle is the development of moral expertise, because you're developing the people in the community as well, right? So there's a socialization process that happens in that environment that's much more likely to produce people who are able to live in that sort of a social structure that promotes moral expertise. So, so these are some really, these are the kinds of issues that I sit around and I think about all day. This is my wheelhouse right here, right? But when you think about this, you've got to have a community that has a lot of different kinds of knowledge, right? So you need people who are experts in their respective domains and who are listened to. So if you look at what's happening right now with this pandemic, the experts, their voices are being pushed down. They're being overshouted, right, by people who are interested in a different kind of organizing principle for society. They're interested in a more economically, personally beneficial organizing principle, right? So to benefit a certain class of society. And I think that this is, in times like this, it's a perfect opportunity to look at what is the underlying organizing principle in the society and what are the kind of results that it's manufacturing. Well, these results are bad results. I think that in the United States, I think that there was a good idea. I think democracy is a fantastic idea. But I think that when you have a social organizing principle like capitalism, which is basically what our social organizing principle is, then you are going to end up, let's say, certain types of capitalism, right? So there are different varieties of capitalism, and some are better than others. But capitalism is just inherently problematic with respect to its openness to exploitation, right? So certain kinds of capitalist systems are necessarily exploitative. So when you have that as your organizing principle, you're going to end up losing your democracy. You're going to end up losing your moral expertise, because that's not what you've been defending. And I honestly think that moral expertise is something that's worth defending, because I think that everything hinges on that. I think that everything hinges on that. So I think that morality is a lot more complicated than people make it out to be. I think that it should be treated as a lot more complicated than people make it out to be. And I don't think that there's any particular individual that we should rely on to tell us how we ought to be morally. I do, however, believe that there is something really powerful in having an individual who represents those features of moral expertise, right? So a person, whether it's a fictional character, I don't know. I mean, I've grappled with this for a long time. Like, it's important to have that sort of a human guide, right? A human type guide. I think Jesus was supposed to sort of satisfy this role, is this need for somebody who's human to help guide toward a community, toward a state of moral expertise. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I think what could become problematic is if everybody has to have this same individual. I know that sounds weird. But there's sort of a shape, personally I like to think of, there's a sort of a shape that wisdom itself takes, right? And a person who's shaped by wisdom is probably going to be a fairly good guide, right? So this is like a moral heuristic. Because we don't know yet all of the factors that make a society one that has moral expertise, we have to rely on sort of these heuristics in our decision making. And I think that having whether it's just something that's in your mind, like you have this mental guide, right? Like a Jesus kind of figure who is shaped by wisdom, or who's sort of cut out of that cloth. I think that's a fantastic heuristic for how to move closer and closer and closer to the right kind of decision making that's going to lead to a more socially cohesive set of conditions and ultimately a set of conditions that lead to moral expertise, right? Now, how do you know that the wisdom that's guiding you in your own mind really is wisdom, right? You might think that there is just a fact of the matter about what wisdom is. It's probably true, but that's where communal engagement matters, right? So if you're in a group of people who are all committed to, and this is, I think, the function that religion was supposed to serve and that hasn't done so well because it's been infiltrated by people who are interested in power structure, right? But I think the very idea of having the communal discussion, right? So religions have gotten this part right. This communal discussion of what is it that wisdom's telling you, right? So there are lots of like evangelical type of religions where people get together and they talk about what God has been telling them, right? And then they sort of bounce it off each other and they say, okay, well that does or does not sound like something that God would require of you, right? So there's a certain kind of expertise in the community in terms of what is God, right? What you can have a kind of expertise about, theological expertise about what kind of God is it that you're worshiping, or what is your spirit guide like, right? So Christians have a very well-developed idea of what that is. And so when people are reporting what God has told them to do, right, in their meditative times, when they're reflecting on God or praying, people who have some expertise can say, well, that's either theologically consistent or theologically inconsistent or whatever. But when people report that and they discuss it with one another and they sort of bounce off of one another, they're much more likely to improve that heuristic that they use for their moral decision making. They're much more likely to get it fine-tuned toward the right direction. So I think that it's interesting. Organized religions do have some features that I think are important in developing a really morally comprehensive community, right? I think where they go wrong, though, is in some of their philosophical underpinnings and the fact that there's so much power to be had in a social structure like that, because all you have to do is just tell people, this is what God said, and you listen to me and give me all of your money or whatever, and it's very easy to abuse, right? But then again, we get this sort of power structure that goes along with capitalism and whatever. But in any case, I think it's interesting. I think one thing that's important to do in life is to find a community of like-minded people who you can trust, who display time and again behaviors that are consistent with wisdom, right? And wisdom is a fantastic heuristic for moving you closer to that sort of social moral expertise that is required to have a society that is good for everyone, right? That is actually ultimately good for humanity. So these are implications of a more sophisticated consequentialism, and that actually, I think these are features that are interesting and worth exploring, and that's kind of what I'm doing with my PhD. But I just wanted to share that because I don't hear people talking about this so much, right? I think that there are hints of it out there, and people have pieces of it that you kind of have to like gather them up and put them together to get this sort of picture. But I think that the stirrings of it are out there. But I do think that it's really unfortunate that, in times of crisis, what we're seeing is that our society is not structured this way. It could be, but it's not. And I think that we have a vested interest in sort of trying to undermine the power structure, the kind of power structure that keeps us from experiencing a social order that is better for humanity. Now, I'm not promoting any particular economic view. I'm promoting basically a moral type of view. And that doesn't mean that I think we should have a theocracy. I think that every system is going to be influenced by some underlying guiding philosophical principles, moral or otherwise. And that's all that I'm advocating for, is a set of underlying principles to guide this social structure. And I think that in these times of crisis, it's a perfect opportunity to make it completely obvious and naked to everybody, to bear that underlying structure of your system and really get a good look at what you're doing. And ours is really fundamentally flawed. So that's something that concerns me. It's something that I hope concerns all of you. And that's my opinion. It's just my opinion, man, or whatever. It's a well-informed opinion. It's a very well-informed opinion. But anyway, that's just... I was walking the dog this afternoon and thinking about it and thinking about how... Is it afternoon already? It's afternoon. Maybe I was walking her in the morning. I don't know what time it is anymore. Just thinking about these implications of a sophisticated consequentialism and how people kind of resist the idea that they can't be moral experts because we don't like to think that we're not just wonderful people, but we're not. Obviously, a lot of us just aren't. And that's just a state of being human. But we can do better together. We can do so much better together. And I think that that should be a goal for each one of us. And I think this is a perfect time to practice that, because what happens in times of crisis is people pull together and they form their own sort of support structure where it's lacking. And obviously our society is lacking fundamental support structures, and so we're sort of creating them ourselves. And I think that we need to pay attention to what it is we're doing right now. I think this is important activity, and I think this is natural human behavior, right? So if there's any sense in which morality is an innate tendency, we're seeing what part of it may be innate right now. So, food for thought.